Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. Now my series on the history of the world is taking a turn. We're going to go by decades, starting with the 1940s. Now, I'm not going to talk about World War II. I've done 2 videos on World War II. So if you want to hear about the war, I invite you to go back and listen to those. By the ending of the 1930s, we still had segregation. We had a lot of women that were on their own, as a lot of men were going off to war. The Pope had warned against the evils of Nazism. 1939 was a golden age for Hollywood. Some of the best films of all time came out in just that 1 year. In the late 30s, Orson Welles came out on the radio and read War of the Worlds, a story about an alien attack, scaring hundreds of New Yorkers. Yes, radio was huge. When Superman was born in the 1930s, it became a radio serial, and the family would gather around the radio to hear story after story and soap operas. Now, in New York City, 22,000 Nazis got together in Madison Square Garden, and this is in 1939. Scary. And now, everyone, we begin with the 1940s. In January, Prime Minister of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, is given full powers to counter IRA terrorism. IRA is the Irish Republican Army that wants to kick the British out. Ireland had split in 2, with the British still holding control over the northern part. By the end of the decade, however, de Valera would end up resigning. It was the year that Henry Fonda would star in The Grapes of Wrath, based on a John Steinbeck novel about the Great Depression. Harvard geologists found traces of man in North America 25,000 years ago. John D. Rockefeller would authorize the construction of Rockefeller Center. It was also the year that the Germans began another construction, much more ominous: the Auschwitz concentration camp. This little 5-year-old boy, Tenzin Gyatso of Tibet, became the foremost Buddhist spiritual leader, the new Dalai Lama. He is still the Dalai Lama today. The animated film Pinocchio makes its debut, teaching families the evils of lying. And the theme song When You Wish Upon a Star becomes a hit. Now, Zionists are people who support the development of a Jewish nation. The movement had gained strength in the end of the 30s and early 40s, and Lord Moyne was a British Minister of State in the Middle East at the time. He supported the Federation of Palestine, Transjordan, and Syria, but only conditionally when it comes to Israel. He restricted visas for Jewish refugees, and 4 years later, he was assassinated by a Zionist movement, the Lehis. Marcus Garvey died. Marcus Garvey was a black nationalist and Pan-Africanist. He believed in black equality, but that the races should be separate. He was controversial, to say the least, and he promoted a black migration back to Africa. Colonel Fulgencio Batista becomes president of Cuba, and he would run things in Cuba one way or another for the next 19 years. Now, people needed some relaxation, a respite from all the war news and horrible things that were going on, and jazz and swing, which had black roots, had seeped into white culture. Everybody was dancing. And speaking of jazz age novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby, died. In literature, Santayana wrote Realms of the Being. Ernest Hemingway wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls, and John Steinbeck wrote Of Mice and Men. We end the year with Franklin D. Roosevelt becoming the first U.S. president to be elected for a 3rd term. James Joyce dies at 58. And sadly, English author Virginia Woolf would commit suicide. Baseball great, the Iron Horse, Lou Gehrig, dies of lateral sclerosis. Joe Louis, arguably the best heavyweight champion of all time, would dominate the 1940s. Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia becomes prime minister and would later become president. He was a communist, but he refused to be a Soviet stooge. Communist Ho Chi Minh forms the League for Independence from France in Indochina. Indochina would later become Vietnam. Now, Ho Chi Minh would eventually rule Indochina, and throughout the 1940s led the resistance against the French. It would turn into all-out war before the end of the decade. It was the year of Citizen Kane, some say the greatest film that was ever made. Certainly innovative, it was a masterpiece. It would be quite a decade for Humphrey Bogart, as we shall see, starting with 1941's The Maltese Falcon. President Roosevelt authorizes for Japanese Americans to be put into internment camps on the West Coast. The Indian movement for independence from Britain gained strength with the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Britain offers dominion status if India cooperates with the war effort. India says no, and by August, the Indian National Congress demanded the departure of the British. This would lead to almost a decade of passive resistance, arrest, hunger strikes, and before the end of the decade, India would become independent, but not before much unrest, violence, and civil war. In the end, the country was partitioned into two nations, India and Pakistan. Clashes between the Hindus, the Sikhs, and the Muslims continued, and Gandhi would be assassinated in 1948. The Nazis would prepare public pyres of fire and burn books that they considered subversive. Some of those books belong to the renowned Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, who despaired over this and the conditions of his native Austria. He and his wife would commit suicide. The great actor John Barrymore dies of alcoholism. And actress Carole Lombard dies in a tragic plane crash. She was married to Clark Gable, who was never the same after this. Prince George of England, the wild boy of the royal family, dies in war action when his Air Force plane crashed. And in Rome, for the first time, women are allowed to walk into St. Peter's Cathedral without stockings. George Washington Carver, once a slave, later a chemist and a botanist who revitalized Southern agriculture, has died. Leslie Howard, the actor who played Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, was killed on June 1st. He was serving in the war when his plane was shot down by German raiders. French resistance leader Jean Moulin is captured by the Nazis and tortured to death. The undefeated middleweight fighter Sugar Ray Robinson lost his first fight that year to Jake LaMotta, but he would beat Jake LaMotta in 4 future bouts. And for the next 93 fights after that, he never lost. Pound for pound, one of the best boxers of all time. Now, even though Japanese American children are taught the Pledge of Allegiance in the internment camps, the U.S. Supreme Court declares that it's unconstitutional for the states to require students to salute the flag. Race riots would break out in Detroit and later in New York City. Federal troops were called out. In the end, hundreds were injured and 34 were killed. Young Navy officer John F. Kennedy almost dies when his PT-109 cruiser was split in two by the Japanese. He managed to save most of his crew. It was the year that penicillin would successfully fight chronic diseases, later saving millions. It was the year that Jane Russell scared the censors with the film The Outlaw, and also the year that we all fell in love with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman in the classic Casablanca. French singer Yves Montand makes his debut, and in Iran, the Shah Reza Pahlavi dies. There was an unsuccessful attempt on Adolf Hitler's life, It failed when a bomb that exploded under his desk in his secret headquarters killed one and wounded 12 others, but Hitler survived. Implicated in the plot was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the general, who was given the option to commit suicide rather than face trial. The International Red Cross gets the Nobel Peace Prize. Swing musician Glenn Miller dies in a plane crash. Ezra Pound, the American poet, was arrested in Italy for treason. Anne Frank, 14 years old, half-starved and feverish, and full of lice, dies in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Her diary, later found and published, would inspire millions. What I'm about to say all happened in the month of April. President Franklin D. Roosevelt dies. Harry S. Truman becomes the new president. In Italy, Benito Mussolini is executed, and in Germany, Hitler commits suicide. And just like that, in that month of April, the war in Europe was over. The death camps were opened up and exposed. Executions took place all over. And then Generals Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower discovered 2,000 art objects in a German iron mine. These art objects had been taken from wealthy Jewish patrons, such as Rothschild, Kahn, and Weil. Then the U.S. drops 2 atomic bombs in Japan, and the war is over. In Argentina, strongman Juan Perón takes over, but it's his wife, Evita, who steals the spotlight. Jackie Robinson, son of a sharecropper and grandson of a slave from Georgia, becomes the first black player to join Major League Baseball. Oh, the Middle East, how confusing. The Arab states attempt unity. They form the Arab League, and they threaten oil embargoes if the United States aids the Zionists. In Egypt, Arabs and Jews riot. Some are killed, some are wounded. Britain comes in and tries to control the situation. There's a civil investigation building that's blown up in Palestine, and Palestine establishes a quota. Only 10,000 Jewish immigrants can come in every month. 7 British officers were murdered in Tel Aviv. Now, President Harry S. Truman of the United States supports allowing 100 European Jews to be admitted to Palestine. But Truman rejects the idea of a Jewish state, and he also rejects the idea of Arab dominance in Jerusalem. Arabs stone some British soldiers, and the Arab League rejects more Jewish immigration. There is more violence. Britain attempts an end to the violence from the Jewish underground army, Haganah. In Indonesia, Ahmed Sukarno becomes the president, while Charles de Gaulle becomes president of France. Painter Jackson Pollock leads an innovative artistic revolt. The world economy would be affected forever with the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But then, General George Patton, who had survived 2 world wars, was injured in a car accident and died on December 21st. After the war, Japan scaled back, pretty much did away with its military. It would soon have a new constitution and expand the power of parliament. Emperor Hirohito declared that he was not a god, he was not divine, and the United States agreed that they would not try the emperor for war crimes. In the United States, 800,000 steel workers would go on strike, and in England, the Labour Party nationalized the Bank of England. In the entertainment world, Ethel Merman sang in Annie Got Her Gun. Big films came out, such as Notorious with Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, The Best Years of Our Lives, and of course the big masterpiece, It's a Wonderful Life. The Cannes Film Festival will open that year, and Rita Hayworth would make quite a splash with her movie Gilda. This big, massive, ugly piece of furniture is IBM's first electronic calculator. This is Menachem Begin. In the 1970s, he would become prime minister and sign the peace accords with Egypt. But in the 1940s, he led the Zionist paramilitary group Irgun. They would bomb the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, headquarters to the British government. Britain would confine Jewish migrants in camps. And before the end of the year, many British citizens began to leave Palestine. In China, communist leader Mao Zedong begins the war against the nationalists in the attempt to take over. It will be a long and bloody ordeal. On July 20, in Egypt, the British flag was lowered for the last time as a proud Egypt became independent. Xerography was introduced, kind of a primitive copy machine. And the Nuremberg trials. 9 Nazi war criminals are sentenced to be hanged. And as if the world didn't have enough with war, problems in the Middle East and the war in China, we have the French-Indochina War. Indochina would later be called Vietnam. The Vietnamese would fight against the French, and this war would last until 1954. Chicago gangster Al Capone died. John D. Rockefeller donates land for the new United Nations Center. Multimillionaire Henry Ford dies at 83 with a fortune of $625 million. Novelist Willie Cather dies. And novelist Mickey Spillane does his debut with I, the Jury. The Broadway play A Streetcar Named Desire makes its debut, and in England, Princess Elizabeth II gets married. General George Marshall, now Secretary of State, offers aid to the economic recovery of Europe with the condition of European unity. The Soviets reject European unity as a condition for the aid. Later on, General George Marshall would win the Nobel Peace Prize. 4,500 Jews got on a ship called the Exodus, left France, and made their way to Palestine. But they were denied entry by the British. This was due to some of the violent attacks by the paramilitary group Irgun. So the Jews had to turn around and they made their way to Hamburg, Germany, where they were placed in internment camps. That same year, the United Nations partitions Palestine into Jewish and Arab sectors. Now, this angered the Arabs, and this prompted riots and protests inside of Palestine and outside in Syria. They call this a Zionist scheme, a crusade for the Jews. Soviet, American, and French flags were burned. As for the Jews, they celebrated and danced in the street for the fulfillment of their 2,000-year-old dream, a country of their own. The TV set promises to make its way into Americans' living rooms. In December, Romania's King Michael is forced out of power by Soviet-backed communists. A Bedouin shepherd boy finds some stone jars filled with old ancient scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient writings including an almost complete Old Testament. Jewish and Arab forces would fight each other in Palestine. Thousands would die. But the British mandate ended, and on May 16, the State of Israel was born. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion read the proclamation, and Chaim Weizmann would become the first Israeli president. Egypt would then invade Israel and bomb Tel Aviv, even though a truce was signed sometime in July. In Greece, the nationalists fought back against the communists, killing over 2,000. And the communists took over Czechoslovakia, and Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk committed suicide even though many suspected foul play. Now just think, at the beginning of the 20th century, many homes did not even have electric wiring. But now the typical home had electronics all over the place. In the morning, you could get out of your electronic blanket, take a shower with heated water from your electric furnace. You could have a hair dryer, electric sterilizer for the baby bottles. For breakfast, you could use your waffle iron, your coffee maker, your egg beater, your toaster, egg timer. You would have a refrigerator, a dishwasher. To clean your clothes, you had a washer and dryer. You had an iron, electric clock, electric heating pads for babies, phonographs, and radios. The world had changed. The Cold War intensified as the Soviet Union extended its dominion over communist countries. Now, Germany had already been partitioned, and Berlin had been partitioned in two. The Soviets blocked Berlin, but the United States flew in 3,000 tons of food. The Cold War had begun in earnest. Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein died that year. And over here, Humphrey Bogart, again, stars in the film The Treasure of Sierra Madre. If you look at that boy, the little boy on the right, that is Robert Blake. He was one of the original Little Rascals and would later be star of his own TV show, Beretta. Laurence Olivier would bring Hamlet to the screen. James Stewart would star in director Alfred Hitchcock's film, Rope. And Georges Braque, who helped create the Cubist movement, wins first prize in the Venetian Art Festival. In South Africa, Prime Minister Jan Smuts was pushed out of power by the Nationalist Party. And very soon, apartheid, the separatist movement, would take precedence. The 1944 Olympics had been canceled because of the World War, but in 1948, the world was able to enjoy the Olympics in London. In Amsterdam, Queen Wilhelmina gives up the Dutch throne to her daughter Juliana. And speaking of the Dutch would go into Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. They would arrest President Sukarno. And it was only a year later, due to protest and international pressure, that the Dutch would pull out. In China, the communists were beginning to win. They overran Manchuria. This was a devastating blow to leader Chiang Kai-shek, and it happened on October 30th, his birthday. In Japan, Hikari Tojo, who was general of the Imperial Army, and 7 others were sentenced to hang. T.S. Eliot wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in Italy, the masterpiece, The Bicycle Thief, personifies Italian neorealism. America is shocked when Alfred Kinsey researches 5,300 men about their personal sexual habits so he could write the sexual behavior of the human male with intimate details. Libraries hesitated to put the book on their shelves. Paperbacks became very, very popular, and audiences were mesmerized by Andrew Wyeth's painting, Christina's World. Well, nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek was losing the war against the communists in China very badly. Mao Zedong would stay and establish the People's Republic of China, while Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan to continue the struggles from the new Republic of China, Taiwan. So we had 2 Chinas. The People's Republic of China, led by the communists in the mainland, and small Taiwan, the Republic of China. In Hungary, Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, who was always an outspoken critic of fascism and communism, was arrested and convicted of treason. He was given life imprisonment and tortured, but he would be released 8 years later. The United States and Western allies organized the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Actress Rita Hayworth married Muslim playboy Ali Khan. Then, actress Ingrid Bergman and Italian director Roberto Rossellini left their spouses so they could marry each other. Now, this marriage did not last. I wonder why. Look how happy they look. RCA announces a new system that would allow them to broadcast color television. Frank Sinatra continues his rise as a crooner, and Louis Armstrong wows them in France. Now, writer Margaret Mitchell, 13 years after having her book Gone with the Wind published and 10 years after the movie came out, sadly was hit by a speeding car. She died. She was 48 years old. Prince Rainier III becomes the King of Monaco. Art patron Solomon Guggenheim dies at 88. This is the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Legendary actors Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn star in Adam's Rib, one of their many collaborations together. And Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles star in The Third Man. And finally, George Orwell publishes his grim, highly paranoid book, 1984, where the dystopian and totalitarian world is reflected among authoritarian governments more and more. Now, would the future be so grim as George Orwell sees it? We'll have to see as we continue with the series. Next up, the 1950s. Were they so great? We'll find out. But in the meantime, comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.